Okay, good evening, everybody. Let me go straight in. Last day we were discussing state as it occurs in Marxian theory, particularly as Marx has discussed it. But of course, the theory of the state has been more elaborately discussed by Engels and later by Lenin in State and Revolution. We are discussing basically three aspects of the theory of the state. Oh, just a second. Can you can you see the slide? Dipro, slide দেখা যাচ্ছে? Can't, কেন? দেখা যাচ্ছে না? Can't share your screen. কেন বলছে? What is saying it can't share? Why? Can you see it now?
Not yet.
What is happening? I'm to বুঝতে পারছি না. I'm sharing and
ওটা কি কোনো পাওয়ার পয়েন্ট একটা ফাইল করা আছে?
PowerPoint. Sorry, an error has occurred when screen sharing.
হ্যাঁ, সেটাই। ফলে তো আপনি বেরিয়ে যান।
বেরিয়ে গেলাম।
পাওয়ার হ্যাঁ, মানে
হ্যাঁ,
পাওয়ার পয়েন্ট থেকে বেরিয়ে যান। আপনি পাওয়ার পয়েন্ট থেকে বেরিয়ে যান আগে।
PowerPoint থেকে তো বেরিয়ে গেলাম।
হ্যাঁ,
PowerPoint থেকে তো বেরিয়ে গেছি।
হ্যাঁ।
হ্যাঁ,
এইবার দেখুন তো
আমি দুবার তো সেটাই করলাম। এখন পুরো মিটিং থেকে বেরিয়ে যে আবার এলে লাভ
পুরো
আছে কি?
মিটিং এর সঙ্গে সম্পর্ক মনে হচ্ছে না আমার। আচ্ছা বেরোন দেখি একটুখানি মিটিং থেকে
আচ্ছা, আচ্ছা, I'm leaving the meeting, I'll rejoin.
হুম, হুম।
Yeah, শোনা যাচ্ছে?
এবার শেয়ার করুন।
হ্যাঁ, করছি। Can you see?
হুম, হুম,
হ্যাঁ?
হ্যাঁ, হ্যাঁ, এসছে, এসছে, হ্যাঁ। Right, হ্যাঁ।
Okay.
আমিও কিন্তু এখন অনেক টেক্সাবি হয়ে গেছি দেখছি।
হ্যাঁ? দেখা যাচ্ছে?
আমি অনেক টেক্সাবি হয়ে গেছি। হ্যাঁ, আমি সব বলে দিচ্ছি যে কি করে করলে হবে টবে।
তুমি তুমি যে বলে তা তো হয়নি। আমি মিটিং ছেড়ে আবার ফিরে এসেছি। যাক গে, ছেড়ে দাও। আচ্ছা, in our last lecture we had discussed two kinds of overdetermination that occur in the genesis and structure of capitalism. One lies in the variability of V, that is variable capital, and the other in primitive accumulation. We discussed this in some detail. We'll not go into it again. We also began our discussion of the Marxian theory of the state. we had said that there are three elements that we will discuss. One is the instrumentalist view, the other is the autonomy view, and the third is the ideological state apparatus. Now, we had partially discussed the instrumentalist view. We will continue with that. We'll complete that part today, and then we'll go on to the partial autonomy of the state view and the ideological state apparatus. We will then begin our discussion of Marxist ideas of emancipation, and I think this constitutes the core of Marxian theory. What is his idea of emancipation? Where does he give his emphasis? It will take us through two lectures at least. So let me just finish fast the theory of the state. Now, the instrumentalist view of the state apparatus claims that the state is an instrument of class power. Now, this is from State and Revolution. The state is a product and a manifestation of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. The state arises where, when, and insofar as class antagonism objectively cannot be reconciled. And conversely, the existence of the state proves that the class antagonisms are irreconcilable. Now, if you recollect, we were discussing the state and revolution is basically built on Engels' family, private property, and state. Now, Engels claims that Engels discusses how the state emerged in within a society in which the class antagonisms were not that developed. It emerged in order to maintain certain to coordinate certain functions. And this again is discussed later on, that Marx also says, talks about this, that these functions, Lenin talks about this, that these functions will be required after the revolution, when the system is moved towards a classless society, and slowly it will be imbibed within the associated independent people, working people, and the state will wither away. Now, the state uh, emerges in order to fulfill certain functions of coordination within the people who are grouped together in a society. But it becomes a state properly when there is irreconcilable class antagonism and it represents the ruling class. If the state is the product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms, if it is a power standing above society in general and alienating itself more and more from it, it is clear that the liberation of the oppressed class is impossible, not only without a violent revolution, but also without the destruction of the apparatus of state power, which was created by the ruling class and which is the embodiment of alienation. Now, this is actually the state and revolution is like most of Lenin's pieces and some of Marx's pieces also, is written as a polemical piece. He's arguing against the Menshevik position, saying where the state is considered to be, we'll see that the autonomy view is partially what the Mensheviks were saying, that you don't have to destroy the state mechanism. You can use the existing mechanism, you can because it's above the state, above the society, so you can use it and really do away with the elements of bourgeois rule. Now, against this, Lenin is arguing that if it is a class power, then you cannot. There's a violent revolution is needed, and it must destroy the state power. Often there is a confusion between the abolition or destruction of state apparatus and the withering away of the state. Lenin elucidates the distinction in state and revolution. The previous quote was from State and Revolution. While the bourgeois state has to be forcibly destroyed, as its organs are suitable only for class rule by bourgeoisie, the post revolutionary state will wither away. The latter will be a gradual process as the coordination functions are taken over by the cooperative agencies of the community of associated producers. The former is a violent and revolutionary process. Now, what Lenin is saying, this is just a gist of what he is saying, is that the state, for example, which exists today in the developed capitalist countries, it is entirely the legal system, the system of the judicial, the executive system, the law and order system. It is all based on the idea of private property, and it's made for the defense of private property. So once this idea of private property is taken away, the entire constitution breaks down. The system of law will have to be totally replaced. So the state system will need to be totally destroyed and rebuilt again. So that will be a violent process. Now we will not dwell at length on this problem, as we will propose in our next lecture. Marx's philosophical insights suggests that revolution is never completed. So unlike what Lenin is saying in State and Revolution, that the revolution is completed and then there is an association of independent, there's a community of associated producers, and the state will become a voluntary thing which will be embedded within each individual who in consciousness, and so will not require the state. Now this is something which goes against the grain of Marx's philosophical insights, as we will argue that the revolution is never complete. Now moving on to the relative autonomy position, one must remember that the instrumentalist view of the state emerged as a part of a polemical debate. Lenin was arguing against attempts to domesticate Marx and Engels, as was done to all revolutionary writers after their deaths. Now, what Lenin was saying is that in the case of all revolutionary writers after their death, there are two things which are done. One is you try to erase them from history. The other is that you try to appropriate them. Now, this process of appropriation is something, of course, with which we are all familiar. You can see that the revolutionary songs, these are being sung not by just by the leftist parties and their youth wings. They are being sung by Trinamool Congress. They are being sung, I suppose, I don't know, but I suppose they are being sung also by the RSS. They are, of course, being sung by the student wings of the Congress. So you see, this is, you try to appropriate, and then you can see that the figures, icons, particularly of Bengal, you know that these icons are completely being, Rabindranath will be appropriated even by the RSS. So this is a kind of thing that goes on. We are saying that there's an attempt to domesticate Marx. Lenin was trying to argue that this kind of the Mensheviks were trying to do this, according to Lenin, that you don't have to destroy the state. This is one aspect of it. Specifically, in the context of the state, the Mensheviks took their cue from Engels' view that the state emerged from society, that it was not a class society, but pre-class society, that the state emerged from society and stands above it. Now, we have seen in the previous slide, this alienates itself more and more from society as it begins functioning as the instrument of a particular class. So it emerged from society before it was a class society. It stands above it, and then the third point is that it alienates itself from society and becomes the instrument of a particular class. So what the Mensheviks were arguing, that you could reverse this process, that it would stand above society, but it could be purged of the functions of its particular aspect as the instrument of class rule. Against this position, Lenin argued that the bourgeois state, being a product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms and a structure devised for bourgeois rule, could not be amended to serve the needs of emancipated humanity. The relative autonomy model says that though the state works as an instrument at the hands of the dominant class, it generally exercises its power with a certain degree of autonomy. This view too takes its cue from the statement that state emerged from society and stands above it. Since it stands above it, it at least shows that it has a relative degree of autonomy. It is not directly a part of the capitalist structure. Hence, it is argued to be relatively autonomous. The possibility of autonomy of the state is most forcefully articulated by Marx in the 18th Brumaire of Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, this is a quotation from that. Only under the second Bonaparte does the state seem to have made itself completely independent. As against civil society, the state machine has consolidated its position so thoroughly that the chief of the Society of December 10th, that is Louis Bonaparte, suffices for its head. And yet the state power is not suspended in midair. Bonaparte represents a class, and the most numerous class of French society at that, the small holding peasants. Now, this is a very problematic statement that Bonaparte represents a class, the most numerous class of the French society at that, the small holding peasants. So the state is autonomous from the ruling class, is autonomous from the bourgeoisie. It is representing the small holding. This last statement is quite confusing. Was it then upholding the interests of the small peasants alone? Miliband interprets it as meaning that it should be seems to represent. Now, this conforms to Marx's own statement in the same 18th Brumaire. Marx makes the statement as the executive authority which has made itself an independent power. Bonaparte feels it to be his mission to safeguard bourgeois order. Now, previously he's saying that the Bonaparte becomes the state, and here Marx is saying that Bonaparte feels it to be his mission to safeguard bourgeois order. So it is not as if the state becomes a small-holding peasant state, that it represents their interests. So Miliband says that actually what it should read is that it seems to represent the small-holding peasants. That is how Bonaparte is presenting it, as a relatively autonomous thing, not directly connected with the bourgeoisie, but actually Bonaparte feels it to be his mission to safeguard bourgeois order. The state does not act according to the dictates of the ruling class because the ruling class lacks homogeneity. This is one of the arguments given why the state is relatively autonomous. There are factions of the bourgeois. Now frequently they have conflicting interests. Financial capital has conflicting interests with productive capital. Within production, in productive capital also, there will be the sectoral interests will be conflicting with one another. Then some monopoly capital will try to get privileges from the state. So the state does not act according to the dictates of the ruling class because the ruling class lacks homogeneity. Ralph Miliband argues in Marxism and Politics that as the state acts on behalf of the entire ruling class, that is the bourgeoisie, within the nation, it has to mediate between factions. It has to see that this factional fight does not cause any harm to the economy, must keep it at some equilibrium. This allows some flexibility of decision making, thus opening up the possibility of bargaining by other classes too. In the case of crony capitalism, state acts on behalf of a particular faction. Now, that is what this is discussed in great detail by many commentators on the Indian economy, that what we now have today is what is called crony capitalism. That is, some significant monopoly capitalists are given special privileges by the state and at the behest of the state by finance capital, and this gives them the ability to grow far in excess of the average growth rate of capital, and this is what is called crony capitalism. Now, in this case, of course, the state acts on behalf of a particular faction instead of trying to balance between the factions. The organs of the state, bureaucracy, judiciary, police, are manned by people who belong generally to the upper strata, but not necessarily the exploiting class. So this is another reason why there could be relative autonomy. You see, the people who belong to BCS who belong to IAS, you will not very frequently, but it's not infrequent either. It's not very scarce either. You'll have examples of people, because I have been teaching for a long time. I have seen this, that students who are committed to progressive views, they go into the administrative service with the hope that they can deliver some goods to the people. So it is banned by people who belong generally to the upper strata, but not necessarily the exploiting class. In some cases, they belong to the vanquished ruling class. In some cases, they are middle class individuals, those descended from urban colonial service holders in India, for example, petty bourgeois families too. There are also exceptional but significant cases like Balasaheb Ambedkar, though they generally have been absorbed ideologically into the ruling class. Now, this Harsh Mandar, I think Harsh Mandar is his name, he runs Action Aid, which is which has now come in for various kinds of sanctions. Harsh Mandar himself was belonged to the bureaucracy. So people like them, there are those. So he's saying that Miliband says that this is one of the reasons why the state has a relative degree of autonomy, because there are individuals who make a difference. The state or those who run it are also motivated by the objective of maintaining power. Now, the state cannot simply go on doing everything for the capitalists, because the party in power will have to try and maintain its power, particularly if it's a democratic system. This may lead to the grant of privileges to the ruled segments, welfare state, targeted benefit schemes, affirmative actions. Affirmative actions means actions which you take in favor of groups which have been discriminated against, socially discriminated against in the historical times. Affirmative action, extra legal help to those excluded from the society, etc. So these are things that the state does in order to ensure that those in power can maintain power in a political setup. So in that sense, again, the state has a degree of autonomy. In the context of globalization, the state is constrained by capitalist accounting systems. For example, budgetary requirements. So it cannot just go on, say, cutting corporate taxes as and when it pleases, because it is constrained by the accounting system, or by pressures from domestic capitalist lobbies and international economic organizations like WTO and IMF to work for capital in general. Capital in general, so it's not so there is a pressure from crony capitalists, there is a pressure from WTO, IMF to work for capital in general, which includes international capital. So there is all these pulls and pushes, which gives it a relative degree of autonomy. The diverse, then also there are the discourse of human rights, etc. The diversity of state forms, ranging from adult franchise to fascist terror, supporting capitalist class exploitation, also points to relative autonomy. The fact of this diversity was pointed out by Marx in Class Struggles in France and Civil War in France. So sometimes it is argued that capitalism actually thrives in a bourgeois democratic setup. Now, there is no one-to-one relation between capitalism and bourgeois democracy. You see, it is true that theoretically capitalism needs only the law of private property exchange and also a yeah, it requires the law of private property, and it requires the law of exchange, and of course primitive accumulation is a necessity, and ongoing the state must implement new laws when new commodity forms are included within the ambit of capitalist circulation. Now, but so does it mean then the state, then of course the state can be non-discriminatory, so it can have the form of a bourgeois democracy where adult franchise and everyone is equal in the sense of political equality, adult franchise, and equal before the law. There's no discrimination in the constitution. Now, this is a form which can theoretically sustain capitalism, but capitalism just requires that its property be guarded, and that it must be allowed to trade. So this can happen even say in our country now. The form we are moving towards, and a lot has we have already traversed a long path of that journey, is far from a secular democracy. So uh, it is probable that, and you see in your neighboring countries in South Asia, there are recurrent instances when the power is passed on to the military. There are recurrent instances of non-democratic system, and still the bourgeoisie has survived and thrived. And so also it is happening in our country. So this means that because the state can take diverse forms, this means that there is also a degree of, this again supports the fact that there is a degree of autonomy of the state. Each form of state power imposes certain structural limits to variations in state policy. When these limits are deemed to be fetters by dominant popular segments of the ruling strata, the form of governance may be changed. You see, there are things you can do given. You see, when the Congress was in power, say when the UPA was in power, there were limits to how far the state could go in helping capital. Now, these limits themselves were felt as fetters by capitalists, and they also wanted that the regime should change. And we have a changed regime, and this regime is such that because of various reasons, which we may discuss in a later series, but it's beyond the ambit of this present series. But we now have a regime which we know from our, which we can just see without going to the theoretical discussion of the reasons behind it. We can see that this regime's popularity and therefore power does not depend on its ability to deliver economic goods to most of the people. Now, even in the face of soaring inflation, even in the face of soaring unemployment, its popularity, the popularity of the regime remains unchecked, because popularity is based not on economic criteria, but is based on discriminating a Hindutva agenda. So, in this case, it can do things which the previous regime could not. For instance, the labor codes, pushing through the labor codes. Now, so this then helps the capitalist. So the state, each state form has certain limits to which it can help the capitalists. And if the capitalists feel that this state form is no longer, it may want a change. Now, if it wants a change, it doesn't mean that the state will, the change will occur. Whether it will occur or not will depend on various factors. People have to accept it if it's a democracy, etc. But this is perhaps the reason for the increasing centralization of power. Abolition of checks and balances resulted from independence of the judiciary, bureaucracy, and police that we see in India today. Because this could be one of the reasons that the funders, the capitalists, really want that this system of judicial, the democratic checks and balances of bourgeois democracy, this should go. And this we find continuous conflict between the judiciary and the government, and which is leading to a situation where all the power is centralized, so the state can do whatever it wishes. And what does it wish? It wishes things like the labor codes. Now, the ideological state apparatus, the idea of relative autonomy leads to recognition of persuasion as distinct from coercion as a means of preserving cohesion of the ruling class or classes and of maintaining class power. Now, the idea of the ideological of persuasion of ideological state apparatus, this was there in Marx, not very well articulated, but it was later articulated by someone called Louis Althusser. But we can read it even in Marx. So this is from Capital Volume 1. The advance of capitalist production develops a working class which by education, tradition, habit, looks upon the conditions of that mode of production as self-evident laws of nature. Now, we are so reconciled to it. You see, we hear stories. I was not born then, that the tram fare was raised by 1 paise, and then there was so much of conflict because of that. Now, but nowadays, you see, there is roaring inflation, and people are taking it as if there is no alternative. So why? Because we have succumbed to the idea which was taught by which mainstream economics and mainstream media promotes, that the market works by its own laws. So if the prices are rising in America, prices are rising all around the world, so how can you complain? So and this is something which we are educated, our tradition, our habits, everything, this embeds these ideas in us and looks upon the conditions of the mode of production as self-evident laws of nature. So this, then you don't need any armed body of men. Apart from the armed body of men working for the ruling class or the modern wings, legislative, executive, judiciary, police, state power is also exercised through hegemony or persuasion, or what Althusser calls the ideological state apparatus. This strengthens the relative autonomy proposition in a superficial or apparent sense. Apparent, because the coercive state apparatus remains ever prepared to take charge if the ruled rebel or even demur. Now we have seen this happening time and again in the case of the farmers' rebellion. We have seen this in the case of strikes. We have seen how violently the state can react against this. We have seen this in the case of the student movements in what used to be my previous employer, Vishwabharati. So it's the apparent the ideological state apparatus as an autonomous. It supports the apparent uh, autonomy, because this is only apparent autonomy, because whenever the ideological state power fails, then the coercive state apparatus comes into play. The ideas of the ruling class, this is from German ideology, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. That is, they rule not only the ruling class but also the ruled. That is, the class which is ruling the material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal consequently also controls the means of mental production, so that the ideas of those who lacks the means of mental production are on the whole subject to it. So for example, the working class, the agricultural laborers, uh, students, for example, all they are subject to the ideas of the ruling class. For example, that is liberalism, that what the market does is the best, for to give just one example, and that there is nothing better than a bourgeois democratic state where the rules of property are guarded. Without such rules, there will be inefficiency if you have socialism. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relations. For each new class which puts itself in the place of one ruling before, it is compelled merely in order to carry through its aim to present its interest as the common interest of all the members of society. Thus, this is again from German ideology. Thus, aspiring ruling class must attain hegemony before the revolution can succeed. Now, this is something which we had discussed in a previous lecture. For example, when the bourgeois revolution took place in England, the monarch was beheaded in 1640. Now, the parliamentary party led by Cromwell, this parliamentary party did not consist only of the bourgeois. The bourgeoisie was a minuscule part of the population. So they gathered together the serfs, the peasants, the craftsmen. Why? Because everyone was fed up with the feudal bondages, and they were willing to rebel against the feudal bondages. And this is they. So the idea of the ruling class, that is the bourgeoisie, it presented its own interest as the interest of everyone. And this, of course, you see, as we discussed in that lecture, that the call of liberty, equality, fraternity, all these are very loaded words. Each can be interpreted in various ways, and so it was done in order to in order to motivate people. For example, equality, we had discussed this example, that after the parliamentary party came to power, the natural demand of the poor was for adult franchise, that everyone should, there should be one person, one vote. And then the bourgeoisie and the landed aristocracy, they argue that no, that can't be so. Why? Because unless you are owning property within the country, you have no interest in the welfare of the country. So the propertyless should not be allowed to vote. So you see, equality was now interpreted in a different way. But these what are called the floating signifiers or the empty signifiers. That is, words which can be interpreted in various ways. These are used in order to make to gain hegemony of a class, for a class which is trying to become a ruling class, displacing the old existing ruling class. All the organs that embed culture into individuals to make them obedient to authority, including the state. If you are obedient to your parents, you're obedient to your guru, you're obedient to the mullah, then you learn obedience. You're obedient. You never question your teachers. Then you learn obedience, and you become obedient to the state also. All organs that embed culture into individuals to make them obedient. This is the culture, the ruling culture, obedient to authority, including the state. Makes the obedient thinking subjects are part of ideological state apparatus. Now, what are these organs? Althus has attempted to list these. One, there is the religious ideological state apparatus. He calls this a system of different churches. Of course, we know that in a different context, it could be the VHP and all the Hindutva brigades, then the Muslim organizations. All these are religious organizations. These work in order as religious ideological state apparatus. But given that the state is more moving towards a fundamentalist Hindu state, the relevant religious ideological state apparatus would be the Hindutva, those who teach Hindutva. The educational ideological state apparatus is a system of different public and private schools. The family itself is an ideological state apparatus, because within the family we learn that you should not question your elders, for example. Now, unquestioning, uncriticality, this is very necessary for the stability of any exploitative order, any repressive order. So this is taught within the family. Then there's the legal ideological state apparatus. It says that a crime is very often, you find that you take this Lakhimpur Kheri. Now they're saying that he has been in custody for 1 year, so he should be granted bail. I don't know what has been the outcome today. Person mowed down so many farmers indiscriminately, with the full knowledge that he could escape the grip of law. And now you're saying that he's in prison for more than a year, so he should be granted bail. But you never think of the many farmers who are in bail in prison without trial on charges of sedition, which is not proven, which is not even charge sheeted. So you see, the legal ideological state apparatus, this law that the judge will tell that no, of course you should not bail should be given to a person, can't be kept in prison. So, but there's no system whereby you can investigate why so many political prisoners are there without trial in the jails. The political ideological state apparatus, including the different parties. You see, this is particularly true. The bourgeois state is sustained by the leftist parties to a very large extent. You see, the leftist parties, they can control dissent. In fact, you will hear that from people who are in the human resource development section of the corporate sector. You hear that they prefer to have leftist unions because they are more disciplined. They do not challenge authority to the extent that the other trade unions, they are very unruly, so they are difficult to control. So the political system, including different parties, this is the part of the ideological state apparatus. The trade unions, the communications ideological state apparatus, press, radio, television, etc. Now you see, I used to watch NDTV. Now I also watch it out of habit. But you can see the palpable change in the way in which news is presented, what is presented, what is not presented, how it is presented. This all becomes very, you can see it very clearly at work when the ownership changes. The cultural ideological state apparatus, literature, the arts, the sports, they are now just like, for example, we heard a few days ago, Ravichandran Ashwin and then Rohit Sharma saying that they didn't want the day and night tournament matches, because in the night in India, particularly in October, there is a problem of dew, so it gives undue advantage to the team which bats second. But then it is unlikely that will be newspapers tell us, because it's the person who has purchased the corporate sector, which is purchased the television rights. So naturally, they would want to broadcast at a time when the most maximum number of people can watch it. So in between, some, because some will view it during the day hours, some will view it during the night hours, because it is, when it is night here, it will be daytime in somewhere else, etc. So the sports also, this becomes a part of the cultural ideological state apparatus. It becomes commoditized, and it is no longer games. uh, so he just we are not going to the details of this, but Althusser attempts to list the ideological state apparatus. But this is a restrictive taxonomical approach. There is no, the point is that there's no unmediated vision. You can't there's no, people say that you, uh, that person's view is politically biased. That person, because normally this is what we talk of, say about leftists, that that person is a leftist, his views are colored. But actually there is no uncolored, there's no way in which you can directly view without the mediation of any point of view. You see why? Because whenever we see anything, whenever we express anything, it is done through the medium of a cultural sign system. Generally it is done through the medium of language. So the language that you use, the words, the vocabulary, the grammar, etc., they constrain what you can see, and they also constrain what you can express. Now you frequently hear this complaint that that person is uncultured. Now there's nothing called uncultured. That person has got a different culture. Now, so what we consider the culture is what is proper to the existing class system. Now what is improper to it? One who challenges authority, uh, uses vulgar words, So vulgar words in the presence of elders, say. Now that would be something which challenges the existing system. Now, so it is not just the institutions, but the very fact that you cannot view, you cannot see, you cannot express without the mediation of a science system, which itself is the product of a particular society, that itself becomes a reason why the state can maintain its power. These are the products of the class divided society, not always in a conspiratorial way. They produce truth effects. You see, what is true and what is not true. You say, for example, you use say that when you are writing or researching in economics, what data do you use? You use government data. The government data, and that is also the index of reliability that the various journals use. When you are writing about anything, you use government data, then it is reliable. You use other data, is not reliable. Now, this itself, but the government tampers with the truth. So the truth effect, what is official is true. See, this is one kind of a truth effect. Uh, Now, when you talk about that, why is the price of say cooking gas increasing? You say that while because the government wants to give greater advantage, greater profit to the gas producers, the private producers. Someone say this is, but when someone says that no, this is because the market is saying this, demand and supply saying this. Now that is true. Why? Because that is what the truth that we have been brought up with. So it is not only the particular institutions which produce, which help the existing ruling class, but it is the very culture, the way in which we look at reality, what we consider truth, that helps the ruling class. So that brings us to the end of this segment. So I'll move on to the other segment. So if there are any questions on this segment, shall I take it now or shall I move on to the next segment? Okay.
আমার একটা প্রশ্ন আছে, শুনতে পাচ্ছেন প্রণব দা?
হ্যাঁ, হ্যাঁ।
হ্যাঁ, প্রশ্নটা হচ্ছে যে এই আইডিওলজিক্যাল স্টেট অ্যাপারেটাসের সঙ্গে ফলস কনসাসনেসের কি সম্পর্ক কিছু আছে?
আইডিওলজিক্যাল স্টেট অ্যাপারেটাসের সঙ্গে
সে
আমি
ফর এক্সাম্পল
এবার বলবো যে আইডিওলজিক্যাল স্টেট অ্যাপারেটাসটা মানে ফলস কনসাসনেস তার একটা অঙ্গ হতে পারে, হ্যাঁ, কিন্তু আইডিওলজিক্যাল স্টেট অ্যাপারেটাস ইজ লার্জার দ্যান false consciousness. মানে false consciousness, obviously it helps the ruling class, but even without false, মানে for example, religion, Marx very clearly says that religion is not, মানে it is not a false consciousness, মানে it is a product of the alienation which is produced by society. So you cannot unlike Feuerbach যেমন বলছে যে মানে একবার যখন মানুষ বুঝতে পারে যে what is God is a product of the projection of your own goodness into the clouds. Once people can be made to understand this, this will be the end of religion, because it is a false thing. It's a false consciousness. But Marx is saying that no, this is a product of the society. Unless you can end the social inequality, unless you can end the alienation existing within the earthly family, you cannot end the alienation of religion. You cannot do away with the holy family. So it is within the earthly family, and if it is within the earthly family, then it is not false consciousness. There can be false consciousness. False consciousness can help the ruling society, but consciousness which is born, for example, like I was saying, that the statistical methods of producing truth. Now, this is not false consciousness. This is necessary to the system of calculations and the system of research within the country, within a system, and this is producing a truth effect. Unless you do this, you narrate the stories of poverty, well, that is not acceptable. So, false consciousness does help in maintaining class rule, but this ideological state apparatus is larger than the false consciousness.
না, আমার প্রশ্নটা হচ্ছে যে এটা থেকে প্রসিড করে আমি যদি প্রশ্নটা এইভাবে ফ্রেম করি যে এইটা মার্কস যেটা বলছেন ফয়েরবাখের প্রসঙ্গে, সেটা তাহলে দাঁড় করাচ্ছেন উনি এই যুক্তিটা যে এটা তো ফলস কনসাসনেস নয়,
না,
এটা তো যৌক্তিক ভাবে এটার একটা আমরা ভিত্তি দেখতে পাচ্ছি, তাহলে ওটা ফলস কনসাসনেস হলো না।
না,
এইবারে আমি রুলিং ক্লাসের যে আইডিওলজি সেইটাকে আমি যখন আমি যখন সেটার বিরোধিতা করব, তখন সেটাকে আমি ফলস বলে প্রমাণ করবার চেষ্টা করব, নাকি আমি কেবলমাত্র আমার একটা আইডিওলজিক্যাল পজিশন আছে, আমি এইটাকে বিশ্বাস করি, আমি এইটাকে সত্য বলে মনে করি, সেইভাবে আমি ওটাকে কাউন্টার করব?
এখন এইটা দেখো, এইটা আমি ঠিক মানে হ্যাঁ, what Brunel is saying is, if, for example, this question of God and religion, if we take Marx's views from the thesis on Feuerbach, then it is not false consciousness. It is born out of the real conflict within the state. Now, if you want to fight the ruling class, his question is, then if you want to find the ideas of the ruling class, what would you do? Would you try to preach to the people that what they are saying is false? Or would you just go on and say that preach your ideology? Now, you see, the question of my answer, of course, I'm not very competent to answer this, because how do you organize political movement? That is something really beyond me. But I would venture this much, that, you see, there is nothing, I can't say that what is statistically proved is false, and what I say from, say, episodic experience is true. Just as I can't say that classical political economy is false and Marxian political economy is true. This is what Marx is saying. Now, you can, that is the whole exercise of overdetermination and the significance of politics. That it is not that it is true or false, it is my political decision. So from that, I would rather say that I will go to the people and tell them my point of view, rather than trying to say how false is their position. I will, of course, in presenting my point of view, I will say what are the harm that is being done by the way they are ruling but their point of view, trying to prove that Hindutva, that Ram was not there, this is something I don't think really works. I suppose, I hope I have answered a bit of your question.
Yes, yes.
So shall we move on? I think we can move on. Okay. We will be discussing the question of emancipations, Marx's ideas about emancipations. What does he mean by emancipation? What kind of, can you see the screen? Okay. So this in my view is the core of Marxian theory. Now, I've taken this idea, emancipations, from a book by Miliband, which goes by the same name, Emancipation, though I have not stuck to his I have borrowed some things from him, but this is not an academic exercise, so I'm not going into the question of where I agree and where I disagree. The goal of Marxian theory and practice is emancipation of humanity from all bondages. As such, this is the proclaimed intention of many religious messiahs too. So that way that you want to free humanity from all bondages, even religious messiahs like Krishna or Muhammad, like Jesus Christ, they would all say that they want to emancipate humanity. And even the godmen today, they would say they want to emancipate you. Now, these are different kinds of emancipation. Uh, um, in its entry point and focus, Marxism differs in its entry point and focus. The entry point of Marxian analysis, class process, is explained by Marxism's primary concern with emancipation from economic exploitation. This is Marx's basic concern: emancipation from economic exploitation, first concern. Among all emancipations, economic emancipation was Marx's prime concern because of his involvement with and commitment to working class movements. Now, this is what we have been stressing throughout our lectures, that this is not Marx did not discover a science that what was said before was wrong, and he was analyzing society with a particular political objective, which is clearly stated, and this is what marks out Marxism from others. Among all emancipations, economic emancipation was Marx's prime concern because of his involvement with and commitment to working class movements. This is perhaps one reason why the working class was sometimes conceived as not just the leader of the movement for economic emancipation, but as the embodiment of human essence that is expressed in the fully emancipated society. We will see how this conception goes against his own philosophy, but this is how it is often presented in Orthodox Marxism, that the working class is the bearer of human essence, and that is why it is the best equipped to free society, to lead to a society where there will be no repression, not only no oppression, but there will be no repression, no exploitation, but no, and also no repression or oppression. Exploitation is extraction of surplus. Oppression and repression, these would be, say, patriarchy is a form of repression or oppression, but it is not necessarily exploitation. The student-teacher relation, it is generally repressive. It is not exploited. It is not generally exploited that way. So what Marx envisages total emancipation from all oppression and also from exploitation, but his focus is on economic exploitation. That is also why class, though not the best unit for his societal analysis, used so widely within Marxism, because Marx thinks that there is a view that this working class power can emancipate humanity from all exploitation and repression. Therefore, this concept of the class, it becomes central. It can be used for, it is as if it can be used for all social analysis. But this is not what Marx does in his historical analysis or his sociological analysis, but this is what we tend to believe, that class, and this is what something against which the overdetermined explanation says that no, you use class is a very specific definition. Class process is one of production, appropriation, distribution, and receipt of surplus. Now, and then these processes, they divide between classes. The fundamental class process will divide between the producer of surplus and the appropriate of surplus, and so on. But these categories are not the best categories for explaining all social situations, all social processes. But when you use class for everything, this also leads to various possible meanings of class. Now, all these become attributable to Marx because Marx also confuses this. And now, when you see people who are writing a lot, they often contradict even if they are the greatest philosophers, they often contradict themselves at various places. This is true of Marx. This would be true of Rabindranath Tagore, etc. The ultimate emancipation that Marx talked about is human emancipation. Human emancipation, marked by the absence of every form of alienation of man, is therefore characterized by the absence of separation between object and subject. It is a never reached, never reachable goal, a goal towards which we can only strive. In a sense, it aims to replace culture with nature. Now, you see, the little that is discussed about the communist society, it is classless, it is stateless, and it is as if since there is no veil, there, you see, culture, as we were discussing, the system of science, the cultural sieve, so to say, through which we see the world. We see the world through a definite culture, and this definite culture is itself a product of a certain class system. So we see the world and we express what we see through a cultured system. Now, if there is no exploitation, if human beings are totally emancipated, then it would lead to a situation where where everything is transparent. You don't need say a vocabulary, you don't need language, everything. So this is a never reached, it's a never reachable goal. So we can strive towards it, but we never reach it. And this is exactly what the thesis on Feuerbach, it keeps saying that, you see, you through practice, the practice makes the bridge between material, matter and thought. And again, through practice, the matter and thought are both transformed. So this goes on. There's a continuous process of change. So there is, just as revolution is never ending, this goal is also never reachable. From the viewpoint of Marxism, at this stage, that is at the end stage, there is no class. The state ceases to exist. Why? Because the state, what are its functions? It's the instrument of class domination, and it's also an instrument of stability of a social system, a social obligation. Why they will not be necessary? Because there's no class. So the state as an instrument of class domination will not be any longer necessary. It will also not be necessary to maintain the system of social obligations, because these are transparent and embedded in the minds of human beings who are all emancipated. So you don't need to be told to do this or that, because you know, it is transparent to you. Each individual embodies the the emancipated humanity. Both this end of civilization and its bearers are ideals that cannot have a material body. It is often portrayed that the proletariat is the bearer of this final human destiny. Proletarian is supposed to embody the human essence. This is not an imposition by some Marxists, but can be substantiated by quotations from Marx. Now, we are not going into these quotations, but Marx himself claims in the political Communist Manifesto also, it appears that as if the working class can free humanity in all senses. We will come to this discussion presently. Elsewhere, his successors like Lukács and Lenin argue that the workers constitute as such only a class in itself. The everyday experience of the workers does not embed the human essence in their consciousness. It is known to the party leaders through their theoretical study. They educate and transform the workers into class for itself. This distinction is important and will be elaborated later. Now, class in itself and class for itself, this distinction. Now, what we are saying here is what we also talked about in a previous lecture. Now, see, Lenin, particularly in the three sources and three component parts of Marxism, says that what are these sources of Marxism? English political economy, French socialism, and German philosophy. So it's all intellectual. So all this, and it clearly says that trade union through trade union work, trade union consciousness cannot directly lead to socialist consciousness. Why? Because the worker has only a limited experience, does not have an experience of the whole society, and therefore he suffers from economism. He wants to improve his own being, his own status. Now, so the worker will have to be educated by people who know this, who have studied this, the intellectuals who are the party leaders. So this is another, instead of saying that the workers themselves are the bearers, it is the vanguard party, the Communist Party leaders, who are the bearers of this human emancipation, and they can convert the class in itself to a class for itself. Class in itself is the class defined in the sense of production, appropriation, distribution, and appropriation of surplus, and which is aware of its antagonistic relations, but is unaware of its potential as hegemonic class. On the other hand, class for itself is one that is aware of its potential hegemonic role. So you see, it is not just the class in the sense class in itself is not just the class in the sense we had discussed, in the sense that the neo-Althusserians define it. It is just class process is one of production, appropriation, distribution, appropriation of surplus. But class in itself is this together with awareness of its antagonistic relation. It is the worker, the peasant is aware that I am that my interests conflict with the interests of the capitalist, my interests conflict with the interests of the landlord, my interests conflict with the interests of the financier. But it is not aware that it can itself take control of the society. That is, it can itself take a hegemonic role, persuade others that we can make a better society. On the other hand, class for itself is one that is aware of its potential hegemonic role, its potential to assert its rule on society. Because of his anti-essentialist position, Marx was practically concerned with the possibilities and limits of partial emancipations. You see, Marx, the essence of human being, this is something which Marx is not really concerned about, because Marx believes that there is no essence of man as such, because he is against both mechanical materialism and also against idealism. So our ideas and matter keep developing through the connection of practice. So because of his anti-essentialist position, Marx was he was not concerned with that essential ultimate emancipation, practically concerned with the possibilities and limits of partial emancipations more than about the character of human emancipation. Among partial emancipations, Marx thoroughly investigated what he calls political emancipation of the state, apart from economic emancipation, which was his principal concern. By political emancipation, Marx meant freeing the state from the need to discriminate on the basis of belief and property. Now, that is establishing a secular and what we know as a modern democratic secular state. So the state does not discriminate between people on the basis of religion. That it is not the Jews. That was the principal concern of Marx, that the Jews are discriminated against. In our country, we know that the state is gradually moving from this kind of secular democracy. It's moving to a state where it discriminates between its citizens. In fact, they might be even denied citizenship in the long run. It discriminates between within the population on the basis of religion. And Marx was talking of political emancipation in the sense that the state would not discriminate either on the basis of belief, particularly talking of religious belief, or on the basis of property. That is, every adult would have the right to vote. Not that you have this amount of property, only then you can vote. So I think I will end here and take questions if there are any.
Can I ask him two questions actually? One is that you are talking about political emancipation is the ultimate goal, and the state is becoming less effective and secular and liberal democratic state. But the thing is that as long as state is there, can there be political emancipation? If it is,
Yes,
if
political, you see, it depends on how you define it. As Marx defined it, of course, political emancipation remains, the state can be there and we can have political emancipation. Because by political emancipation, what Marx meant was that the state should not discriminate between its citizens on the basis of any criteria. He was talking of two criteria mainly, on basis of religious beliefs and on basis of amount of property that you own. If the state does not do this, then there is political emancipation. That is, you see, it is all the ideas are based on a historical situation. So the historical situation was freeing from feudalism. Within feudalism, the state discriminated on various grounds. On ground of property, you had various tiers of rights. So there would not be any discriminatory rights. Everyone would have equal rights, and this leads to also the we'd say the false consciousness that people are all equal. That is not so, as he says. We will discuss this. That the inequality that prevail within the political society is now displaced to the civil society. Now, you have exploitation without political discrimination, but there's political emancipation, but economic exploitation.
okay. But when he talks about the wither of state, later stage, because state cannot be the representing the whole of the people. When state is there, it is definitely representing a partial interest of some group. So the purpose of state uh, will be not, required if there is no discriminations. But when state is there, there must be some kind of discrimination. For example, it's
No,
fine
no,
that
I'm saying it's again, probably I'm not being able to convey it. Of course, that I've said this, that Marx is saying that even with political emancipation, that is, the state is not discriminating, but there will be exploitation. So the state system has built within it the right to private property and the right of exchange. Now, this right to private property and the right to exchange, this itself is sufficient for the functioning of capitalist exploitation.
right.
So,
Got it.
but the state is necessary. You see, the state has to defend private property. The state has to defend contract.
Right.
So, it is apparently a non-discriminatory state, but it is allowing. Uh, so, it is breeding a kind of false consciousness that there is equality.
Okay. And other one is that I couldn't switch on that point of time about the dominant ideology. You talked about ruling ideology and ruling class ideology. I was thinking about dominant, for example, in Indian context today, the pro-religious activity is the dominant ideology because all political parties are actually somehow or other adhering to that. No one is in a position to ignore religion as such, and they are actually trying to combat within the same game where who is more Hindu or who is more religious that they are trying to prove. So this is, though it is not a kind of ruling class ideology or ruling ideology, but still it is having a very major role as a dominant ideology in the political context and responses of different political realities. So,
Actually, the discussion of this would take us beyond the ambit of Marxism. It is a very important discussion, but probably elements of the discussion of the theory of populism, the new ideas of subject of hegemonic formation of individual subjectivities. All these would be helpful in understanding this kind of new. I'm not. Am I audible?
yes, yes,
Yes,
yes, audible.
Yes, am I audible? No,
Yes,
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 you are
sir.
audible.
I'm audible. Okay. No, so I think what you are saying is an important question, but I don't think we can discuss it with the theoretical apparatus that we have so far developed.
Okay, we'll take it on later on. Just one question that, in relation to that earlier one, that Marx never counted that gender discrimination is a part of any form of discrimination or things, because he's talking about when there is really no political emancipation in the question of political emancipation. The political emancipation in the context of state is ensuring the equal say of the people, and also they are not discriminated on the ground of religion and other things. But he did mention gender, right, in this context.
No, no, we will. You are raising very important points. Last year also it happened. We will talk about this with in the last segment that we'll discuss is new ideas, and there,
Okay.
and in fact we will see that Marx didn't. It is. I would make a stronger statement. Where we will discuss this very shortly in. I think the next lecture or the lecture after that, that Marx made very sexist remarks and also Engels. Hmm. So not only
Okay.
did they not discuss gender, but you see, one must realize that no one is a messiah, or there's no messiah, there is no God. Nah. So you see, everyone is a product of one's time. Uh, you know,
Right, right.
so that is not, that should not be taken to show how bad Marx was. You
No,
see,
no, naturally. In that context, the gender question was not that very pertinent.
the environment question, for example,
Environment
that
question,
also was
right,
not very.
right, right, right. I agree. Thank you, sir.
Okay. So, Dipro,
Uh,
shall we end it?
yeah, if there are no more questions, we can end the session here.
So thank you, everybody, and see you next Friday. I hope my network is good because I will not be in the city. Anyway, we'll meet next Friday. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Good night, everyone. We are meeting in on next Saturday.
Next Friday. Huh? Right. Thank you.